Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Today I'm going to be exploring the area around Victoria Station in London. Now I will start with one quick caveat that generally speaking, if you're in this neck of the woods, I would suggest you just head over to Belgravia. That's where I believe the best pubs close to Victoria Station are to be found. I have covered that twice in videos before. I'll put links up there in case you haven't already seen those. And I've also done a video more over to the Westminster side, close to the Houses of Parliament. But somewhere in between those two areas, there are still another handful of pubs that I think are interesting close to Victoria Station here, and that's where I'm going to be heading today. Pub number one, and I realise I've picked a bad day for it now because the scaffolding's up, the Windsor Castle. Cheers from the Windsor Castle. I used to work in the area around here 15 years ago now or something, so I knew this pub around 2010, give or take, and at that time it was still known as the Cardinal. It was renamed, I believe, in 2011 to actually revert back to its original name, the Windsor Castle, which is what it has today. So it had a stint of about 50 years as the Cardinal between 1961 and 2011. That name commemorated Henry Edward Manning, who was the second Archbishop of Westminster. That's effectively the head of the Catholic Church in England, and it was he who had Westminster Cathedral built. As I may have mentioned already, I've possibly picked a bad date to visit the pub because they're doing some renovation works on the exterior, so the outside is all covered in scaffolding, so we can't really appreciate much of the exterior, I'm afraid. Just a few glimpses through the scaffolding. It's dated, the current building, to 1896, and that's based on some old photos where you can still see that date in gable, I think, at the top of the building. The ground floor frontage probably dates to that 1890s rebuild. It has some grey granite pillars. I'm guessing they're probably from Aberdeenshire, composite capitals and floral flourishes. The lower panes of the main windows are quite interesting. They're square with some diamond inserts, and they have a mixture of cut and etched glass in them. There are two entrances from Francis Street and a further two from Windsor Place round the corner originally, but I think one of those has now been turned into just a window. It's a Sam Smith's pub today, and typical with many Sam Smith's pubs, they've reinstated the partitions, possibly the layout they would have had in that late Victorian period. As is the norm for these Sam Smith's pubs, there's some very nice, albeit a recreation, etched glass in the panelling there in those partitions. The bar counter has recessed fielded panelling, and there is quite an attractive stillion and or bar back behind that almost island bar. I think it is possibly an island bar counter. And then the room I'm sitting in at the back has this rather magnificent skylight here with some stained glass in it. I suspect this was originally a billiards room, and you often see those kind of skylight features in those late Victorian pubs when they have a billiards room. Possibly dotted about here and there are some Victorian era fireplaces as well. Not entirely sure if they're original with the pub or if they've been added later, but they're certainly of that era, and quite a nice cast iron radiator to the side of where I'm sitting right now. They don't actually have any outside drinking space here at the Windsor Castle in its current form. I think I'd seen some older photos with a few tables outside, but as it stands right now, there's a sign saying do not take any drinks outside. So I've finished my half. As I said, it's a Sam Smith's pub. I had a half of Old Brewery Bitter. I'll put the price on the screen there. That was actually on the hand pumps for a change. A lot of Sam Smith's pubs nowadays in London seem to just have the keg version. So I thought I would go through the history of the pub quickly here. I found an article from 1961 attesting to that name change from the Windsor Castle to the Cardinal. It looks to me as though Francis Street hadn't been laid out yet at the time of Hallward's map of 1799. This area was still just open fields. The London Wiki, or pubs history website, says that the earliest mention they found written down for the pub is from 1823, and I found the same in newspapers. It's a record of an inquest held here. Here's the area on Greenwood's map of 1828. By that time, both Francis Street and Windsor Place had been named on the map, so it's my guess that either the pub took its name from Windsor Place or possibly vice versa, but more likely the former. Found this nice advert from 1903. It also mentions the billiard room, citing it as the finest billiard room in the district, brackets 2 tables. So again, I think that probably is that room at the back with the skylight. There is a note in that advert that the Windsor Castle Musical Society holds its meetings here, and here's some more about the exploits of the Windsor Castle Musical Society. That included a rendition of a song called Golden Dustman, which rather caught my eye, and actually you can find on YouTube a rendition of that from a couple of decades later, I think. Pub number 2, the Cask and Glass. Cheers from the Cask and Glass. I think this is probably a Georgian building. It's in yellow stock brick, and you can tell from those brick arches over some of the windows on the upper floors. Sometimes quoted as being one of London's smallest pubs. One of the things I like about it most is the fact that it still has a carpet. There's some nice panelling on the bar counter. The gantry above the bar counter has advertising mirrors for Shepherd Neame. I don't think they can date back any further than the 1990s, as we know that this pub became a Shepherd Neame pub in 1991. There is some wood panelling on the walls, and shelving above that panelling has a nice old collection of bottles and other beer related knickknacks. There is a fireplace towards one end of the bar, and in total there can't be more than a handful of tables in the whole bar space. It is just a single barroom pub. It was apparently first licensed in 1862 and originally was known as the Duke of Cambridge. That name ran for about a century, and it changed its name to the Cask and Glass in 1962. It would presumably have been named for Prince George, the Duke of Cambridge, who was a cousin of Queen Victoria. He died in 1904 and had children, but his children were considered illegitimate because he didn't seek permission from Queen Victoria to marry. He married an actress, in fact, Sarah Fairbrother. So the title died out, the Duke of Cambridge title, and wasn't revived again until 2011. Of course, now applied to our current heir to the throne, Prince William. It started as a beer house. We've encountered some of these before in previous videos. These are pubs that were only licensed to sell beer and wine, not spirits. And it was still a beer house. It still had that status in 1893, as recorded by this newspaper article here, because the landlord was being prosecuted for selling spirits illegally, contrary to the terms of his license. It looks like he was caught by a planned police sting operation. Note particularly the policeman here had assumed the character of a free-hearted sailor. I like the fact that they really put some effort into that. It's not marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map with the usual PH, probably because it still had status as a beer-only house at that time. We've seen that before. And it's in fact not even marked on the more recent mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map, but I believe it had converted to a full public house by that time. In the 1950s and 1960s, the wife of the landlord was a relatively famous actress called Amelia Bainton. She appeared in several of the Carry On movies in relatively small parts, and also in various TV series of the day, including Dixon of Dock Green, Z Cars and On the Buses. Here is a 1960s advert for Gilbey's Gin, which features the pub. Lovely sketch of it and a description that suggests that it may have been designed by Beatrix Potter. So we can assume at that point in history the pub did have a full license as it was serving gin. So it became a Shepherd Neame pub in 1991. It seems they actually saved it from a potential planned demolition. The council were only hours away, if this article is to be believed, from approving a demolition by the previous owners of the pub. So we have Shepherd Neame to thank today for the fact that the pub still exists. The article actually mentions that at that time this was thought to be the only pub in London serving half pints. As it happens, I have a half pint. more because I have talking to do than anything else. Today, of course, they serve full pints, which is interesting because the French house in Soho is famous for this, only serving half pints. And I wonder if that is actually a relatively recent gimmick. And in 1991, perhaps it was here the Cask and Glass was the only pub in London doing that. I heard a couple of possibly apocryphal accounts of this pub. One that it was Jules Holland's local at one time. That may well be true, I don't know. The other one that you probably have to take with a pinch of salt is that particular regular said he had on one occasion seen Prince Philip slipping in here incognito, the palace of course being just round the corner, for a cheeky half. Not sure we can really believe that, but it's a lovely story if it were true. So it's a Shepherd Neame pub today. Here's a look at what they had on offer on the bar, and I went for a half of Spitfire. I have to say that is a bit nicer than I remember it. Not always the world's biggest fan of Shepherd Neame beers, but that is actually in quite good shape. I'm quite enjoying that. Pub number 3, the Pineapple. Formerly known as the Colonies, very recently renamed. Cheers from the Pineapple. So the pub has very recently changed its name, I think possibly even this year, and has reverted to its original name. So it was the Colonies for something like 50 years, from 1974 to 2024, but prior to that, for all the rest of its history, it was the Pineapple as it is again today. I don't know that there's really a lot to get excited about here in terms of the exterior or the interior, but I do find the history of this pub kind of interesting. Its beer garden occupies this alleyway at the back, and that gives a clue to the fact that there has actually been a pub here for a surprisingly long time. The frontage is in some sort of darkish turquoisey colour now, presumably some version of Farrow and Ball, and there's much more of that on the inside, alas. There's a couple of interesting gables on the second floor, and there is at least a nice run of window boxes all along the first floor. We actually know the date of this building from a newspaper article I found. It was rebuilt in 1905. Inside, as I say, the recent refurb, if it wasn't already Farrow and Wrecking Ball to death before, it has been even more so now. So there's that sort of horrible turquoisey paint job all around on the inside. I don't recall, in fairness, the interior being particularly special in its former incarnation as the Colonies either. I think they tried to go for a sort of colonial American era theme. I think the sign had a picture of the Mayflower on it and that sort of thing, but that was all just a sort of confection of the 1970s. At best. I find the name very intriguing, the name Pineapple. It initially sounds like it's a modern name, but this actually goes back some way. The pineapple was first introduced to England in probably the 17th century, and here is a wonderful painting of Charles II being presented with a pineapple at some point in the 1670s. And partly because of the fact it was something that was exotic and initially hard to grow here in England, it acquired this sort of status symbol as this object of wealth and ostentatiousness. And I think its use as a pub name followed on from that. The London Wiki site says that the pub was established here in 1809, and I certainly wasn't able to find any records for it before that. But the little alleyway at the back, which is where I'm sitting now, is called Pineapple Court. Until recently, there was actually a Westminster City Council sign on the entrance to Pineapple Court. I'm a bit sad that that's gone, but I believe this is still marked on the map as Pineapple Court. This little alleyway may not have always been called Pineapple Court, but I believe as a thoroughfare it has existed in some form or other, possibly going all the way back to that painting of King Charles II in the 1670s. Here it is on William Morgan's map of 1682. At that time, the only road that was laid out and named is Cabbage Lane, which is now called Castle Lane. And there is a number there that, if you consult the key, I believe says that this alleyway was called Mustard Alley at that time. In 1720, Sir Matthew Decker commissioned this painting to commemorate what was probably the first pineapple grown in England, thanks to his very talented Dutch gardener, Henry Tellender. And a few years later, Tellender's method for growing pineapples in cool climates was published in a general treatise of husbandry and gardening. By the time of John Rock's map of 1746, Cabbage Lane had been renamed to Castle Lane, and the alleyway is again clearly visible, leading to some gardens with trees in it. I wonder, is it too much of a stretch of the imagination to suggest that possibly one of those buildings there could have been a hothouse growing pineapples at that time? The knowledge certainly existed in England, and I wonder if that's where the name of Pineapple Court may have derived from. By the time of Horwood's map of 1799, the street we know as Wilfred Street was laid out, originally called William Street, and most of those fields or gardens we saw previously have now been built on. Once again, that alley is there as a cut through between William Street and Castle Lane. The earliest mention I could find of Pineapple Court was in January 1810 in John Lockie's Topography of London. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of the pub is from 1832. Around that time, it seems Pineapple Court was actually quite a disreputable address. There are several accounts in the newspapers around that time of young ladies luring men here to steal their clothes and other possessions. On the 1860s to 1870s Ordnance Survey map, the pub is marked with a PH, and Pineapple Court is also named there. It's a Green King pub today. They do seem to particularly like those makeovers involving that turquoise, possibly Farrow and Ball paint, don't they? I went for a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. Here is a lineup of what was on the bar. This is always a slightly more expensive than other beers when in London, so I'll put the price for... Always reluctant to put the price on screen because people have a bit of a meltdown in the comments about that. Pub number 4, the Buckingham Arms. Cheers from the Buckingham Arms. The current building dates to 1898. You can see that in a gable at the top. I would say there's possibly a bit of Queen Anne revival about the architecture here. It's predominantly red brick, and certainly from the first floor up, and there's a bit of white stone dressing, and those gables are also a bit of a motif of that style. There's a shallow oriel window that goes from the first up to the second floor. The ground floor frontage is quite interesting. The windows have small leaded panes, and there's a bay window, and that follows round to what is now the main entrance on the right hand side, and a very satisfying curve. There is also a column or two into space between the windows. It looks to me as though there were originally 3 entrances here, and the one which is actually where I'm standing right now to one side has now been turned into a window, and there's another entrance which enters into what I think camera's What Pub site is referring to as the alley bar. There is a very thin, narrow bar room running down one side of the pub, and they say that originally it was used by servants so that they weren't observed while they were in the pub. Interestingly, they've turned that into a display of the art of brewing now, so you can see some of the various apparatus and stages of the brewing process depicted there. Camera's What Pub site also notes some refurbishments that took place in 2009, and thankfully they left much of the material behind the bar counter, particularly the bar back and some of the etched glass and mirrors in there, intact. At that time, some of the stained glass was introduced, so although that actually looks relatively convincing, I could just about believe that may have been from the late Victorian period that apparently is modern. There is more pleasing curvature, if that's the right word, more pleasing curves in the bar counter. Etched glass, as I said, in the mirrors behind the bar. There is shelving above that bar back, and today that has a collection of barrels atop it. There is a nice banquette seating area in the bay of that bay window, which I hope I'm going to be able to get some footage, but obviously it's a very prized space, so I don't want to disturb the couple that are sitting there now. On one wall there is a collection of portraits. I should have done my research probably, but I think that's possibly the various Dukes of Buckingham throughout the ages. This pub actually goes back quite a long way. It was formerly known as the Black Horse, and it was renamed to the Buckingham Arms in 1901. In its guise as the Black Horse, it goes back to at least the 18th century. I think somewhere inside the pub it said that it was established in 1780, but there are records suggesting there has been a pub on this site for even longer than that. John Rock's map of 1746 has what I believe is labelled as a Black Horse Yard. There's another word in there I can't quite read, and that's off Petit France, so that rather suggests that there was already a pub here at that time called the Black Horse. Note also the vineyard in this map. That really caught my eye. I think the standard consensus on why Petit France, this street here, is called Petit France, is that at some point in history it was settled by Huguenots, and it's tempting to think that they may have brought their winemaking knowledge from France with them. Here's the 1860s Ordnance Survey map, by which time Petit France has been renamed to York Street. There are no fewer than 5 pubs along this stretch here, and I think only 2 of those remain today. I think the Buckingham Arms is the second one along. Here it is again on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, by which time I think at least one of those original 5 pubs has gone. There is a nice early 20th century, I think, photo here of the exterior of the pub, and at that time it was already clearly a Young's pub, you can see from the livery, so it is very much a Young's pub today. Camera's What Pub site notes that it has consistently been in the Good Beer Guide since its inception, and they had a better than usual, I would say, range of guest beers on the bar. A couple of them were off, but it is a Tuesday lunchtime, it's hardly peak time of the week, so I went for a half of Adnam's Broadside. I think this is in very good shape. Put the price on the screen. Pub number 5, and it's just a few doors down from the Buckingham Arms, the Adam and Eve. So I was just interrupted by the lady from behind the bar who's informed me that apparently I need permission from Green King head office in order to do anything social media related. So that's the first time that's happened. Always ask behind the bar if it's okay to take a few interior shots first, and almost unfailingly whoever is answering that question just says yes, it's fine, without really querying it. Occasionally some people will ask what it's for. I explain it's for a YouTube channel. So in this case, in the Adam and Eve, just as always, I said, is it okay to take some shots inside? The lady said, yeah, whatever, fine. And then subsequently I went to stand outside to do the talky bits, round the corner from where anyone else was standing. So I don't think I was disturbing any customers, but apparently in order to do social media, according to this lady at the Adam and Eve, you need to contact Green King head office. I do have a bunch of shots of the interior, and I had recorded the commentary on the exterior, interior and history of the pub while I was standing outside. I of course don't actually need permission to film outside the pub. I was just standing on the pavement to do that, which is a public right of way. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not going to use any of the footage I took inside or immediately outside the Adam and Eve because I just don't think it's worth the hassle. I don't really think you're missing much. It's an okay pub, but I'd say for me it ranked joint 5th of the 5 pubs I visited today. Okay, that's going to be it for this video from, where am I, Embankment Gardens or something. Bit of a weird end to that one, first time I've ever been told to stop filming. But thanks very much for watching, I hope that's been interesting, and I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.